What's up, guys? It's Cody. I'm on day 99 of the Odin Project, and I'm still working on the final JavaScript project. Today is Monday, and it was a good day. So I've been working on making this flavor wheel for the Sensory Lexicons form so that I can dynamically update the flavor wheel as the user is entering in new attributes. Make it a little bit more interactive from a form perspective. I was also tinkering with it over the weekend. So, well, today I finished making that flavor wheel. Before we get started, guys, I wanted to say tomorrow is going to be my 100th day doing the Odin Project, so I'm really stoked about it. And I'm actually going to be starting streaming again, and I'm going to be doing that tomorrow evening. If you have any questions for me about the Odin Project or about mine and Emily's journey, definitely feel free to show up and hang out in the chat. It's going to be chill. I'm going to be hanging. I'll probably be doing a little bit of project work, just very casual stuff because I'm doing it in the evening now instead of during the day. If you have specific questions, then definitely come and hang. It's going to be a great time. So let's take a look at it. So over here on the screen, I'm going to be playing a video because it actually takes a while to enter in all the data to be able to show you guys everything that this flavor wheel does. So yeah, we're gonna be using this video, and then I'll be jumping back over to the code. But this right-hand side of the video where the your lexicon will appear here, again, black, it's a circle, is where the flavor wheel will actually be built. So I'll just take you through what that would look like just really quickly. So you see the flavor wheel is being built as the form is being made. And then there's the final flavor wheel. So it's not perfect, but it is an MVP for what I'm trying to do. It is not a core aspect of the app in that it's not a core functionality that helps the user to upload information. So I'm going to move on from it from now on, but I can talk about that later. So let's take a look over at the code. So I made a component for this flavor wheel builder. It takes in a lexicon property and an attribute count property, and that's going to be coming from the add pages component where a lexicon state and an attribute count state are being set. So we see we have it down here within this form, and that's what's causing this white square to appear. And then you see that we have an outlet here, which that's actually for the form elements. So it's for where the actual inputs are going to be updating that context and utilizing some of these properties as well. But let's go back to the flavor wheel builder. So we're going to be using those two properties. The first thing though that we do is we get the product name for the sensory lexicon. And so here we're using that lexicon state from the add pages component, and we're going to get the name from that lexicon. And if it's not defined, then it's going to return your lexicon will appear here, which if we go all the way back to the beginning of this video, we see that here. So there's no lexicon name, so it's going to show up right there. Once the lexicon does have a name, once that state updates and there's a name, so the user enters a name and then hits submit, then we see that name updates over here to the lexicon.getName that's been returned plus the lexicon word at the end. So that's that portion of it. And then that's actually just the name. But then if we jump down here, what I'm using for that is we have this SVG that we're building, and that is for the flavor wheel specifically. And the circle part is right here. So we have a circle SVG element that's being defined. But the text that's being added to that is being added as a foreign object, which we are going to be placing essentially right in the middle of the circle. And so then we have a div and we have a P element that has a defined style to actually get it to where we want it to in that circle. The foreign object is just an element that is allowing for the HTML elements within it to be utilized within this SVG. Because SVGs are vector graphics, they don't necessarily work with HTML the same way that they would in just normal old HTML. So that's that, and that'll be used up here in this return statement as well. But this return statement will only be run if there are attributes, which we'll get to in a second. The next couple lines are for the variables to build that SVG and also to have outer and inner radiuses and a radius for the flavor wheel. But then this is our primary logic to tell us whether or not there's going to be actual spokes being added to the flavor wheel or not. So if there is an attribute count, then this code will run down here. For starting off, there won't be an attribute count, so we will just see the black circle with the name of the lexicon in the middle. But then if once the user adds an attribute, which we see here, they're adding an attribute, okay, and now there is actually an arc that is being added to the lexicon. And so how do we do that? We're using the lexicon state in addition to the attribute count state. Attribute count is for the logic, and then the first thing that we do within the logic, if the attribute count is not undefined, is get the attributes from the lexicon state, from the lexicon object, so lexicon.getAttributes, and then we're going to have a attributes array, and we're going to have a separate attributes array because the attributes that are being returned from this get attributes is actually a collection of objects and their methods, and we just want the attributes data specifically for making these flavor wheels. So then down here, we're going to add null values if there are less than 4 attributes added to create blank space on the flavor wheel. So we see that over here. We also see only 1/4 is being actually made for the arc, and then the remaining 3/4 are empty. And we will see that as we add more attributes, the remaining quarters will be filled. And then once we surpass the 4th quarter, then we get to add more and more and more, and we make the arc smaller and smaller. And so we start off first by, if the attribute count is 0, then we're going to return null for each one of the attributes array, and then that's where we have that blank circled to begin with up here. And then as we add, if the attribute count is less than 4, then we're going to create an attributes array that is made up of an array that has a length of 4 minus the attribute count. So if it's one attribute in the lexicon, then it's going to be an array of 3 that has a map to null. So that's essentially going to be building this up here, but dynamically based on the attribute count. So for that example, if there's one attribute, then there'll be 3 null values so that the 3/4 are blank. But over here, this one will have 2 null values since there's 2 attributes that are being within the lexicon state. Down here, we're going to see that we're actually trying to get the attribute names from the attributes object, and we're pushing that to the attributes array. And then down here is where the D3 comes in. And so these two D3 functions are going to be generators for the arc and for the pi. The arc is going to be the data that is generator functions to generate the data that's needed for the arcs, specifically the inner radius and outer radius of these arcs. So that's going to be from 0 to here for inner and 0 to this outer. And then also the angles. So it's going to be all the mathematics that needs to be calculated to produce the data for these arcs. And then the pi is also going to be related to the math, essentially doing some of those calculations specifically with how the arcs are sized. And so that's going to make more sense going down here to our return statement. Here we're going to use that pi function with an argument of attributes array. So it's all the names of the attributes. And we're going to map over that. And each element that's going to be within that mapping is going to be a slice, which is going to be what's returned, the data that's returned from the pi. We're going to check if the slice data is not null. If it is null, then we're going to have white space, which is just empty transparent arcs. And if it's not, then we're going to actually build these arcs with the attribute names in the middle. So then we're going to use that slice that's generated from that pi function, and we're going to put it in as an argument for arc to get the data for the specific path that is being rendered for the arc itself. And then we're also going to use the arc function with the slice from the pi to get the data for the text too. And we're going to do some transformations so that the text is neatly centered in here, and so that it's also readable. So if we go farther down, we'll see that all of these are fairly readable and none of them are like upside down because of weird transformations that are happening. So that's what we're doing down here, and then also what we're doing with this angle function up here as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the flavor wheel. And so we can see that as we add, we get more and more attributes on here. So it's a nice way to let the user see what attributes they're working on as they're going through. It's pretty dynamic and interactive piece. There's so much more I could do with the flavor wheel and so many ideas that I have with it. You could have additional arcs on the outside to then break it down by modality or to show the references that are within each attribute. But I don't want to go into that too much right now. I think that might be a feature to do a little bit more closer to launch or post-launch as something to kind of get marketing from the engineering aspect of it and the fanciness of the flavor wheel itself. But the real functionality is actually getting the data up into the app and then allowing for specific transformations of the data for the utilities of a sensory scientist. So I'm going to be focusing on that going forward, and I've got a little bit of that to show you guys too today. But before we get to that, let me just come back here. So it took me a while to build this flavor wheel, and again, I'm using D3, so it's a little bit outside of the Odin Project's realm, and so it required a lot of tinkering. These two files here, flavor wheel builder and flavor wheel, are both the two experimental files that I was using to really dig deep and to understand what was going on within here. So you can see it is a mess. It is not pretty. There are hooks, there are crazy functions to calculate the very specific details of the path, SVG elements to get their specific commands for the data. It got really complicated. It required me to look at different articles for different aspects of using just D3 and then also using D3 within React. This was more of a React and D3 combination, so that's where I saw that I could do some mapping and then I could be inserting the arc and stuff into that data element within the path within React. And then going to the flavor wheel, this was just straight up D3, so this is really helpful just to get it working from a D3 perspective. And then essentially what I did was I smashed those two approaches together to actually get to the full product of the flavor wheel builder, flavor wheel builder, and that's what resulted in this. So it was very messy. It was a lot of just like tinkering around and reading and getting to understand the fundamental technologies of what I'm actually working with, and then slowly bringing it all back together and folding it into each other. So I find that very helpful to break things down and then bring it back together for things that I'm doing that are new and I don't necessarily understand. Lastly here, how am I actually doing this? I mentioned about the lexicon state and the attribute count state. So these are being passed as props. The attribute count state is actually going to be modified in the add attributes. So the lexicon can't just be utilized to check if it's been updated because it's actually not going to show the attributes array. You have to return the get attributes method. You have to get the return object from that. So I have it here so that we have the set attribute count being passed as a prop within the outlet context, being passed within the outlet context to add attributes. And then down here, when we actually add the attribute, we're going to set the attribute count to the new get attribute count, to the new attribute count. And that'll update, and then that'll update the flavor wheel and cause it to re-render the additional spokes on the wheel. So really, the attribute count is allowing for the state to be monitored and to be enact re-rendering for this flavor wheel builder. The lexicon is actually going to be used to get specific data from the lexicon and then from the attributes themselves for building the flavor wheel builder. If you guys have any questions about that, definitely feel free to let me know because it is a little bit complicated. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to be working on is allowing the user to import data with a CSV or with an external file. So we see that I have this import route here. I don't know if it's going to stay here, but I'm going to be using this import lexicon component, and this is the kind of beginnings of that component so far. So I'm going to show you guys just very briefly this real quick. I have an input here. We see that it's over here. It's a file. It's accepting CSVs, and so I go here and I click on this import lexicon CSV. So we add that. Okay, so that's been imported, and you see down here I have an array that is 64. It has 64 elements in this array, and we see that it is all of these objects with these properties, name properties. So I am just starting to get familiar with this Papa parser and the React data table component. Pop-up parse is going to allow me to parse the CSV into some sort of JSON or this array specifically, to be able to then modify that and check the data that they're importing in a bit more systematic and browser-friendly way. I'm going to be using the data table component to actually create a dynamic table to allow the user to then view the data that they've uploaded and then make selections to help it be conformed to the database structure that the website is going to be using. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do that, but I know data table is something that I think I want to incorporate into this project, and I have experience with using it for our Shiny web apps where there's a lot of dynamic aspects of looking at data tables in those specific web apps, and it's a little bit more advanced than, or it's a bit more interactive and UI centered than Excel. So we'll see what that looks like down the line, but mainly I just want the data to come in, and I want to start thinking about how am I going to do some validations of this data to make sure that what they're importing is in line with what the database is expecting, and also I will have to think eventually about safety with the site and making sure that only specific types of data can be entered within the website. So, but yeah, that's all I have for you guys today. So remember, tomorrow, the Twitch stream, take a look at my Twitter. I'll also have a link to my Twitch in this video. I'll be doing that 2 times a week going forward, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 3:30 Pacific Standard Time to 6:30 p.m. If you like this video, let me know. If you're interested in mine and Emily's web dev journeys, definitely subscribe, and I will see you guys tomorrow.